So my first question is about your reaction to the events 30 years ago. Whenever you hear the discussion about what happened 30 years ago, whenever you hear anything about the Baltic Way or the downfall of the Berlin Wall, what is your usual reaction? Or how do you react and how do you comment to those events 3 decades ago?
Well, I usually tend to say that I'm really proud of what happened because I was born just a couple of months later after Lithuania regained its independence. And it's a real pleasure for me to always state to anyone that I meet that I was born in an independent country, in a country which managed to free itself from the Soviet Union and to be a democratic country. And it's also a big responsibility for me and for my generation, the first generation born after the Soviet occupation, to really prove that we are a mature society, that we have young people ready to contribute, young people who understand how difficult it was to be free and to become free, especially during the hard times of the Soviet Union. So that's also a push for all of us to see that democracy is constantly need to be strengthened and that young people and the young generation has to play a very prominent role. And I also, of course, speak with my parents, with my grandparents who lived many years, majorities of their lives in some instances, behind the Iron Curtain. And I see how happy they are to look at the development of Lithuania over the last 30 years. So all in all, I'm really proud and I see how many steps we've made forward.
You know, there is a joke in Estonia, a joke about an English housewife. Just a lady in London is reading a morning newspaper, having her coffee, and then there is a short story that there have been deportations in the Baltic states. And then those black vans arrive in the middle of the night, and people are taken forcibly into those vans and taken to the railway station, and then put into carriages and taken to Russia. And then the English lady says, "No, I can't believe it. Why didn't they call the police?" So this is a joke in Estonia about the English. So for the English people, it is difficult to understand that this can happen. And what is really paradoxical that now we have met some Estonian people here in Estonia who are of your age, and they are almost prepared to ask the same question that English lady asked some 80 years ago. So my question is, what about, are there many young Lithuanians who cannot understand history, or who really don't care that much about history? And everybody is prepared to look into the future. And just history needs also knowing the detail. So what about those young people in Lithuania?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, there are certain parts of society that think that we don't need to look back. We don't need to analyze history. We should look forward and to live the life of today, because we are in a convenient situation at the moment. We live in a peaceful, democratic, well-developed countries. So for some, that's enough. But of course, for society to be ready for any challenges that it might face, we need to look back and to understand the problems of those days and to understand how many people suffered, how many people unfortunately died fighting for freedom in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and other countries at the beginning of the occupation, how many people suffered because of the totalitarianism and those ideas that killed a lot of people. We cannot forget that, because if we forget that, we become complacent and we might be more vulnerable for today's challenges, because there are a lot of challenges. I mean, we live in the neighborhood of very difficult countries. We have a border with Belarus, we have a border with Kaliningrad, there is a big border with Russia nearby. So it's a complicated region, a region full of non-democratic countries. And I think that really mobilizes a lot of people. And I can tell you some examples. For instance, when Crimea was annexed in 2014, a lot of Lithuanians, young Lithuanians, people of 20 years old or 25 years old, joined voluntarily the Riflemen's Union, for instance, which is a military organization, but not directly related to the army, and which helps to look at countries' defensive capabilities and helps to contribute for that. Also, we have returned to a system of conscription, but there is no conscription in practice because a lot of people join the military voluntarily, which shows that young people really understand they can contribute to ensure that Lithuania's independence is being protected, especially when the geopolitics are so complicated. And finally, I think for a lot of people living in the Baltic states, what's happening at the moment in Belarus is really understandable. I mean, thousands and thousands of young Belarusians, young and old as well, went out onto streets to show that they want to see different Belarus. And Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia had the same wish, the same mentality some time ago. So we still see that people living nearby, people of 70 kilometers from Vilnius or 100 kilometers from Vilnius, are still fighting for democracy, for freedom, for human rights. And we are in a position where we are much more developed. But if we became again complacent, if we don't contribute each in any way possible, then that could be challenged in the future.
What about Lithuanian schools? Do you believe that the level and the quality of teaching recent history in Lithuanian schools is good enough, and so young people are listening attentively what the teacher is saying at a lesson, or are young people not that much interested in history lessons?
Well, of course, I think that a lot of people tend to say that history is for the past and we must look at for the future, as I mentioned before. So for some, it might not seem the most important subject in schools, and it's constantly being debated whether we teach history in a correct way, whether we really enable people to think critically about history, because it's not only about the suffering of Lithuanians. We also have obviously black marks in our history in terms of Holocaust, in terms of people who unfortunately played a role in those terrible events. So we must look at it from a critical perspective and be ready to discuss important issues, difficult issues related to people suffering. So for that, I think we are more mature at the moment. The discussion is really changing for the better, but it's not easy. It's rather a process. We cannot expect results in the couple of years' time. We need to be open and transparent with ourselves, first of all, and then we become much more capable of discussing issues with foreign countries as well, not necessarily only the friendliest foreign countries, but also those who want to rewrite our history and portray us in a different way in terms of the reality.
Yeah. What about European values? And what about defining European values among young Lithuanians? How do they understand what is the core of the European values? Well, Lithuania is a Catholic country, and Christianity has very deep roots in Lithuania. So my question is, to what extent the Lithuanian understanding of European values is centered around Christianity, and to what extent there are other things in European values? So how do you describe the Lithuanian understanding of European values?
Well, I don't think the understanding is centered around Christianity and Christian values necessarily. First of all, European Union means for Lithuanians or is a proof of Lithuania's development, a proof of the return to Europe. After the unfortunate time of occupation, Lithuania, together with other Baltic states and some other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, basically returned to their place, because we were always a part of Europe, even during the occupation times, in spite of the fact that, of course, we could not have been developing in a way that other Western European countries. So this aspect of returning to the group of Western democratic countries is really important. The second aspect, which is usually discussed, is again not necessarily related to values as such, but it's related to the economic development. I mean, when the Baltics joined the European Union, including Lithuania, our gross domestic product per capita was around 50% of the European Union average. Now it's around 80%, which again proves how much we managed to do over the last 2 decades or so. And last but not least, of course, the European Union is a very special project, also looking at it from a global perspective. It's a unique project which is combining different political cultures, different ideas and geographies of 27 member states. So it's not always easy to precisely define the values of the European Union, but I think that the Baltic states, together with all other member states, have to contribute to this process to ensure that the basic human rights, the basic values of Christianity as well, are not being neglected, and that we don't forget the core strengths of Europe, especially at this time when we face, again, a lot of geopolitical pressure, not only from the big neighbor of Russia, but also from other countries such as China, which propose a very different kind of value set, a different kind of political model.
To what extent do you feel that there is some disappointment in Lithuania about European policies? Well, when I talk about the migration, when I talk about the border guard, the controlling European borders, so on and so this is very acute in Lithuania nowadays, because we are following what is happening in Lithuanian and Belarusian border. So to what extent do you think that Europe is offering sufficient solidarity, and to what extent there is something lacking or some misunderstanding, some sort of different understanding of the situation in Lithuania on the one hand and in the rest of Europe on the other hand?
I would say that Lithuanians are still very optimistic about the European Union, and that is proven on basically yearly basis with the opinion polls taken by the Eurobarometer or any other survey source, which again shows that Lithuanians are very optimistic about the European Union and happy to be the member states. But of course, there is certain disappointment, and I think the main source of that is belief that the European Union could be more effective, belief that 27 member states could really reach certain decisions faster, in a more effective way, especially at the time of a crisis, whether it's a migration crisis or an economic crisis or the same pandemic. I think the expectation is that it could work in a better way. But if you look at the practice, in 27 member states, again, it's a very complicated process. We have a lot of different interests, and in the end, the decision must be a consensus. So we have to really understand how the European Union works, which are the strengths of being in a common union, what are the weaknesses of that as well. And the main weakness, I would argue, is the decision-making process, which will always take some time, especially when you don't have one country leading all others. We have equal member states. So you have to basically understand that. But I think there is some concern that this disappointment might grow in the future, especially at the time of migration crisis or any other challenge, immediate challenge for Lithuania, because you tend to understand yourself to be in a very vulnerable situation. And if there is no precise and concrete reaction coming from your allies, then of course you're feeling left behind. But in this case of Lithuania facing a lot of migration from the Belarusian side, I think we've seen that the EU has reacted, both on the political level and on practical level as well. There were Frontex officers coming to Lithuania. There was solidarity shown in the public sphere, which is important. But again, in the future, I think with the challenges arising, the main issue might be decision-making process and its efficiency.
Yeah, thank you. To what extent do you feel that there is a different perception of recent history in Western and Eastern Europe? When we're talking about the 20th century, when there is an endless number of films made about the Nazi atrocities and Germany, and there are relatively few films about communist or Stalinist terror. So my question is, do you feel that there is a difference in perceiving our recent history in the West and in the East and in Central Europe? And is there anything we could do about it so that young people in Western Europe could also understand the history of Eastern Europe?
I would certainly agree that the understanding or interpretations of history, or at least focus of historic discussions in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, are different, and it's not always easy to reach a consensus or at least choose the priorities which would combine or unite both sides of Europe rather than point out to certain differences. In a way, it's natural. I mean, we've had different histories for the last decades prior to the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in a sense, it's a learning curve for both sides. We have to take into account the different understanding of Western Europe. The Western Europe has to take into account the different understanding of Eastern Europe. And I think it's mostly visible in terms of understanding the atrocities and crimes of the communist regime. In certain discussions, you could still see that those totalitarian regimes are not seen as equally bad. For some, it seems that only, the Nazi regime was bad, but the communist regime maybe had some different ideas which were not necessarily wrong in the perception of some Western thinkers, which is obviously difficult to grasp for people in Central and Eastern Europe who really suffered from the communist ideology, from deportations and the killings, multiple killings, unfortunately, that happened in our region. But us, I mean, the Baltic states or Central and Eastern Europe also have, again, to take into account some black marks in our own history as well. And again, it's also a learning process. So I think Europe is always a very complex thing, whether we talk about the European Union or Europe as simply a continent without any political unions taken into account. It must be a process where both sides, in this sense, West and East, tries to talk about it. And I think there are some good initiatives of that. We have some museums for European history, which at least takes into account different perceptions. We have more dialogue on academic level than ever before. We have books written from both the Western and Eastern European historians together. I think this is very important, but in order to, make those differences less visible, more time is necessary.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now, Michael, my last question is about the future. Are you optimistic about the future of Europe and the future of Lithuania? And even being more precise, do you believe that the generation of your children will be even happier and better off than you are and your generation is?
We are in the best position possible, probably, to really expect the best for the future as well. I mean, what the Baltic states, what Lithuania has accomplished over the last 30 years is really impressive. There are, or there at least were, alternative scenarios of development, and they are visible in our neighborhood. I mean, worse scenarios. So it's up for us to really understand how much has been achieved, what was the cost for that. I mean, it was an enormous effort by the society, or by the political leaders and by all others to reach this result. And for us, it's necessary to understand that the effort is not over, or at least we have not yet achieved the final result. We must work for the future as well. We must contribute to that. We must tackle new challenges, both geopolitical challenges as well as other kinds of challenges, including, for instance, climate change. Because to make the society work, you really have to work yourself, or rather on the individual level. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that there is no other way for Lithuania than to be among the group of the most developed European countries. That group will persist in one form or another, and it will enable us to reach the best decisions possible.
And so I understand that the young generation of Lithuanians is ready to defend their freedom and their rights.
For sure. When I meet young people, I mean younger than me, those who are still in school, those who are 16, 17, or even younger, they are really making me happy because they talk about the society in a very mature way. They understand the issues, they understand the problems, but they also understand that those issues should not be addressed to only political leaders, or they don't expect that someone will come in and solve the problems. They understand they must contribute. For some, that means going abroad, learning in the best universities, and then coming back to contribute to the society. For others, it means staying, volunteering, making themselves active in a society, in small communities or bigger ones. And that, again, makes me really happy. I really hope that this new generation will prove all the skeptics wrong, because there are always those who say, oh, the new generation is really not ready to contribute. I'm on the other side of this argument. I'm optimistic, and when I see those young faces, I really tend to think that we are on the right path.
Mr. Linas Kojala, thank you so much for your answers. Your deliberations have been most inspiring, and I'm very, very, very grateful to you. And once again, te gyvuoja Lietuva.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Ačiū.
Ačiū.
Viso gero.